We'll start today's talk series event. I can see a lot of new faces, so I just want to talk a little bit about why we are hosting such kind of talk series event. So this is the third talk series event that we are hosting in the October month. So we the Tibet Museum are hosting this kind of talk series on the title Tibet Awareness talk series. So why we are hosting is because Tibet Museum falls under the Department of Information and International Relation. So specifically we falls under the Information Department. So the Information Department's main kind of they works on the spreading the human rights and cultural environment situation and Tibetan the Tibet current situation and all these things to spread to the Tibetan peoples, world community at large. So that's why we are hosting this kind of talk series every minimum twice a month. But then today this time we are hosting this is the very third time, so we are happy to hosting this kind of things. And yeah, so today we have the guest speaker, Dr. Tenzil Harunla. So if I talk a little bit about her kind of background, so it's Harunla has done kind of her schooling from TCV school. Maybe most of you might be knowing about that school. So she completed her kind of doctoral studies from JNU and Center for East Asian Studies, New Delhi. And currently she is as a research fellow at the Tibet Policy Institute of the Central Tibetan Administration. And then yeah, it's like that. And then so without taking much time, I would like to pass on today's session to our guest speaker, Dr. Tenzil Harunla, to please commence your talk series. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sendonla, for the kind introduction. So this is a very a topic that I attempted in a very short duration. So pardon me if I do miss out on important points when I go through some of the a very minor sort of research that I've done on this topic. So let me just start right from here. If you look at the title of my presentation, Museum, and how through museum we construct soft power, particularly in the case of Tibetan exile. And before I go on to my presentation, there are few questions, before, say, I speak further. Questions like, what do we mean by, of course, soft power in Tibetan community, in Tibetan exile? And what role does museum play in carrying forward or constructing soft power? And, why is it important actually to create soft power in exile? And what are the role of museum in doing so? So there are, various questions coming up and regarding this topic. First of all, before we move on to, the topic itself, if we look at the overview of soft power, so what is soft power and who coined it and what does it mean by soft power? Of course, it's not new. Joseph Nye is a person who first came up with this idea, soft power, and he coined that word, soft power. And this is his first book in early 1980s. His first book on American power. When that was the time when we see that there's a huge change in the political landscape after the Cold War and the disintegration of Soviet Union, and you see that the Eastern Europe are transitioning from a communist state to a democratic institution. So that's when you see that hard power in terms of defining a country's power on the scale of whether you are economically strong or whether you have a political might or whether you are militarily strong have become less and less more relevant when at the time when you don't have country competing each other. Of course, Russia at the time has already been have disintegrated. Now you have America, who's not contesting it. It's actually building up, coming up as the hegemony in the world politics, right? So that's when Joseph Nye came with the idea of soft power. So what he's actually saying is that, a country to successfully become a powerful country, powerful nation, a powerful state, he has to have both hard power and soft power. And the word even become more, relevant and popular after his second book that was released in 2005, which is titled Soft Power and the Means to Success in World Politics, in which he states that the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or rather than force is what you call soft power. So in that definition itself, you basically see that what is missing here is that you cannot get the results you want just by forcing people or attacking people or declaring war. You have other means to to get what you want, basically, by through your culture, through means of constructing a soft power for itself, and U.S. in that particular has successfully done. So what he argues is that for a successful state like U.S., you need both hard power and soft power. And how does it do that? Is through promoting American culture, is through promoting American ideals and values like democracy and freedom. And how do he do that? Not just through state, but through NGOs, through entities which are not non-government, through agencies, through institutions, through universities also. And one among them is an important part of educating or promoting that idea is through museum. That's where comes in the soft power idea, where museum comes an important path in educating people of what you want to educate other people of. So in this case, if you look into, before we dwell into museums that Tibet Museum in Lhasa and Tibet Museum here, we look into a very popular museum like museums that are built on Holocaust, the Holocaust museums, which are not just seen in America, but in Europe and in other parts of the world. So I would say Holocaust Museum, for instance, why I take this is a very successful museum in terms of educating people of what happened 50 years back, or 60 years back, or 100 years back, right? See, imagine, I can confidently say that because I've been to US, of course, but I've never been to Holocaust Museum. And a lot of people who have never set foot in Holocaust Museum knows about Holocaust, right? And how do we know that? To Anne Frank Diary's book, through books of Holocaust, through a lot of movies that are made on Holocaust, right? So people know about Holocaust not by going into the museum, but we know how it is, what happened to the Jewish community under Adolf Hitler. So that's where museums reach to people beyond its territory, is what we are talking about here. Holocaust Museum is in US, but a person who hasn't been to US knows about Holocaust. So that's the extent to how you promote, how you educate, how you create awareness. Not just awareness, but how you increase responsiveness from the people who visited the museum, right? So museum generally becomes important through its role, through its responsibilities, and through the opportunities it has created. But if we speak museum in general, what it does is it creates knowledge, it brings talent, it creates job, of course, it becomes a tourist attraction. And basically, when museum becomes quite popular, what happens is it becomes a pride for the country, right? So museum becomes a very important space, an open space, a platform for soft power, a powerful space where you form opinion. about the country, about the incident, about what happened 50 years back. So you pass on your memory. Museum becomes such an important agent of creating memory, transferring memory, and not just that, but brings relevance to, what happened in the Holocaust. You can actually feel it, through reading those testimonials, through looking at those objects that are, placed inside the museum. So that's what museum does, and that's how you create soft power about Jewish community, what happened to the Jewish population, right? Moving on to, now, so I talked about how museum has become like a beacon for soft power, and China has obviously realized the importance of museum in creating soft power. And that is why in 1990, when Jiang Zemin first visited Tibet to promote what he calls new economic incentives in Tibet, he highlighted that Tibetans need to be vigilant against the pro-independence activities in Tibetan exile and orchestrated by central Tibetan government. And he emphasized that there is the need to highlight the development that took place inside Tibet with the government incentive, and to blend Tibetan, basically these are highlighted with the aim to blend Tibetan and Chinese culture through a planned economic modernization. So what happens after 9 years? In 1999, you see that Jiang Zemin returned back to Tibet and inaugurated the Tibet Museum in Lhasa, marking the 50-year anniversary of what the PRC calls the peaceful liberation of Tibet, but what we call is the occupation of Tibet. So the museum's opening, the Lhasa Museum's opening was significant political event which signified China's triumph in its efforts to, portray Tibet as an integral part of China. So that's what museum does, right? And choosing Lhasa to build Tibet Museum itself is iconic. Why? Because Lhasa itself is not just the capital city of Tibet, but it's the spiritual, culture, and political capital of Tibetan people across not just Lhasa, but Amdo and Kham and other provinces, which are now, of course, been segregated as Sichuan, Gansu, and so Lhasa Tibet Museum itself becomes an important site, which of course is a state-sanctioned representation of what we call Tibet and the Tibet question. So basically, this building of this museum involves contestation claims over Tibetan identity, sovereignty, representation. That's what our Tibet Museum says now. Misrepresentation, which we would say, and modernization. Of course, that's the whole objective of even building this museum, is to emphasize that China has done so much in Tibet, that Tibetans need to forget the old Tibet. And what the old Tibet is a serfdom, as a theocratic state, slaves are being, used and that, not that and that. But the purpose of building this museum is to not just to forget old Tibet, but to remember what China has done for the development of Tibet. And in turn, what it does is that China creates a narrative, and to push that narrative, to state that Tibet is an integral part of China. China has done so much for Tibet's growth and development, is to push that narrative not beyond Lhasa, beyond Tibet, and beyond China. That's the whole objective and the role of actually building a museum in Tibet Museum in Lhasa. Now, within this discussion, where does this Tibet Museum or exhibition that we have all across India or outside India, where does it come and where does it play a role into? So we see that China is trying to push that narrative forward, and what the Tibetan here's narrative has become more of like a decentralized. And why I say that is that specifically in the Tibet Museum in Lhasa, which is a state government, unlike museums across the world, a world has not just been a state-sponsored museum, but most of the museums across the world are curated, are organized, are built by NGOs, are not built by state-sponsored, are built by like civil society. In fact, it is believed that museums which are built by civil society are much more impactful, much more effective in terms of delivering the message that it is trying to. So what does I left one important part of it. So if you look at the Article 1 of China's protection on cultural relics itself, you can read this, right? You can read the article. So what it basically says that this in many ways framed what China has been saying for a very long time, socialist society, trying to form a socialist society, socialism with Chinese characteristics, ideas like patriotic education and ethnic unity. You can see these coming out of Article 1 itself. So it is a full-function state sponsored with a very state-centric, I would say, a motivation that has built the Tibet Museum in Lhasa. And how is Tibet Museum in here distinct from Tibet Museum in Lhasa? Is that the way Tibet Museum here functions is much more decentralized, of course. And there's we have a huge network that was formed beyond how Tibet Museum is placed inside CTA. And at an institutional level, what I feel is that Tibet Museum needs to be seen not just as an isolated, museum or an isolated form of soft power, creating a soft power itself, but it should be looked as a network of network of connections between what Tibet Museum plays and what other NGOs are trying to educate people about Tibetan struggle. So there is a network and a connection between what Tibet Museum does and what other NGOs are trying to do in terms of how people are in terms of what is the truth about Tibet and what is happening inside Tibet. So basically, when we look at both soft power and hard power, there is no end goal to, when we say what is the end goal of soft power, basically. I mean, do we say, if there is a measurement, if there is a conclusion to stay, if there is something that we can show that this means soft power, there is not. Because soft power itself is a process. It is a process of building a narrative about Tibet. So in that sense, when we look at Cold War period, we see that US at the time has sent or created a lot of museums, has created exhibitions around the world, has sent its curators and people who are involved in museum have traveled across world in Europe, in Eastern Europe and Western Europe and everywhere to do what? To create an image about America, to show them that America is a democratic country and it is very different from what communist China does or a communist country does. So that's the power of museum in creating a narrative. And in that whole idea, what the Tibet Museum, what I feel is what Tibet Museum can do is that we can think beyond how Tibet Museum is placed, how to reach to an audience who are not in the vicinity, like how Holocaust Museum has done. People don't even have to cross or enter museum, but we know about Holocaust. So how do we reach that sort of audience? through museum, not just through museum, but in collaboration with university, say, in collaboration with NGOs, in collaboration with any institute. And when you look at China itself, you might have heard about the Confucius Institute. So basically, Confucius Institute was initially built as what? As a cultural institution that along with a cultural institution, what they do is they teach Chinese Mandarin to people who are interested in studying about China and Chinese language, right? But what was its underlying objective and motive is later. A lot of the Confucius Institute was shut down, not just in Europe, but a lot of them were shut down in America. Why do they do that? Because instead of becoming a cultural center, what it does is it brainwash people. It becomes a sort of like a propaganda site. It sort of influences people with their motive. So that is why we see that what Confucius Institute has done, it has become a soft power. The Chinese are constructing soft power. Chinese are expanding its soft power through Confucius Institute, right? Through engaging with people who are beyond China. So in that sense, what Tibet Museum can do is that it can collaborate with, it can create connectivity, it can create network, it can collaborate with other institutions, not just Tibet Museum, but even a Holocaust Museum. It can collaborate with other institutions to actually build that kind of network. And if you look at this recent article that was published in the print, in the news media, this lady has covered on this Tibet Museum very recently, in October, some 21st October or something. So what she says in her article basically is that there is not much of an object around, but the testimonials and the photographs speaks a lot about what Tibetans have gone through. It speaks the emotions. It speaks the language of the people who, for the first time, has come across what Tibet is. So what museum does is that it engages with people. It speaks with people. It impacts people. It influences people. It changes people's mind about a specific country. And she went on to say that Tibet Museum is a world class, unlike the most museums in India. I know a lot of people will disagree with it, but that's her opinion. So that is what I'm saying. So the Tibet Museum it's successful in a way. Looking at this article, it is quite successful in a way that it impacts people for the first time when she visited Tibet Museum. That's her impression, right? So that's how museum creates soft power and becomes a beacon of construction of soft power. I would rather end here because we can talk more about during our discussion. Thank you.
What you said was like the Holocaust Museum.
Right.
I also think that the museum is only one way to make a narrative.
Right.
It's like
it's not the only way.
People, it's not the only way.
True.
It's also very important to focus on like the education system,
Mm-hmm.
schools.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I learned about the Holocaust, about
Right.
movies, about many other ways.
Mm-hmm.
Because a museum is very bound to one place.
Mhm.
Is it also important to focus on other things that are much easier to spread around the world?
Exactly. That is why I talked about the whole collaboration thing that Tibet Museum now that we have. We can collaborate with other institutions, universities, research institute, foundations. We can build further. I mean, you are right saying that Holocaust Museum it's a place, it's somewhere. But we know about Holocaust Museum not by going there, but we know about it through movies. So we can collaborate with filmmakers, we can collaborate with social media people to create awareness about it. And I absolutely agree with that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. And the last but not the least, I just very much thank to all the audience for the very active participation, raising a lot of very interesting questions. And thank you so much.